Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the economic machine around you is beginning to slow down. Factories are producing less, businesses are cutting jobs, and behind the scenes, enormous financial pressures are building. Throughout the 1920s, America looked extraordinarily prosperous. Cars filled the streets, radios entered homes, factories expanded, and stock prices climbed. But underneath this prosperity were debts, speculation, unequal wealth, and weaknesses that would soon become dangerous. Credit was everywhere. Consumers borrowed to buy cars and household goods, while investors increasingly bought stocks with borrowed money. This practice, known as buying on margin, allowed people to control valuable shares without paying their full price upfront. The stock market became the symbol of the decade's optimism. The Dow Jones Industrial Average rose from 63 in August 1921 to 381 in September 1929, roughly a six-fold increase in only 8 years. If you enjoy discovering the real stories behind history, subscribe to the channel. More powerful stories are coming. As prices rose, more people wanted in. Investors began believing that stocks could keep climbing forever. The market was no longer simply reflecting business profits. Speculation itself was helping push prices higher and higher. This created a fragile system. If stock prices fell, investors who had borrowed money could face immediate losses. Banks and brokers could demand repayment, forcing investors to sell even more shares and potentially turning falling prices into a self-reinforcing collapse. And then, before the famous crash even arrived, the American economy began weakening. The economic expansion peaked in the summer of 1929. Industrial production and business activity started falling, meaning the economy was already turning downward. Some financial leaders recognized the danger. Paul Warburg had warned in March 1929 about excessive speculation. But optimism remained powerful, and the market continued rising even as the underlying economy was beginning to lose momentum. Then came October. After months of uncertainty, selling pressure intensified. On October 24th, Black Thursday, panic swept through Wall Street. Major bankers attempted to stabilize confidence, but the market's underlying weakness could not simply be erased. The panic returned with even greater force. On October 28th, Black Monday, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell nearly 13%. Investors who had believed the boom was unstoppable suddenly faced a market moving violently in the opposite direction. The next day became even worse. On October 29th, Black Tuesday, the Dow fell nearly 12%, while more than 16 million shares changed hands. The crash destroyed confidence and erased enormous amounts of paper wealth. But here is the crucial point. The stock market crash did not single-handedly create the Great Depression. The economy had already begun contracting. The crash deepened fear, reduced spending, damaged businesses, and helped transform a weakening economy into something far more dangerous. As consumers became frightened about their savings and jobs, they postponed major purchases. Businesses responded by reducing production. Factories that had once operated continuously began cutting hours, furloughing workers, and cancelling expansion plans. Debt made the situation worse. Families, farmers, businesses, investors, and banks all faced obligations that still had to be paid. But as incomes and asset prices fell, debts became harder to service, creating a dangerous cycle of defaults and forced sales. Banks were exposed to these problems from multiple directions. They held loans that borrowers could no longer repay, while frightened depositors wanted their cash immediately. Without modern deposit insurance, a rumor about a bank could trigger a devastating run. In late 1930, major banking panics began spreading through parts of the country. What might have remained a severe recession was becoming something much worse. Bank failures reduced lending, destroyed confidence, and pushed the economy deeper into contraction. The scale was extraordinary. From 1930 through 1933, approximately 9,000 banks suspended operations. For millions of Americans, a bank failure could mean losing savings accumulated over years, sometimes with little protection available. As banks failed and people withdrew deposits, the amount of money circulating through the economy contracted sharply. From late 1930 to early 1933, the money supply fell by nearly 30%, intensifying the economic collapse. Prices also began falling dramatically. Between 1929 and 1933, the consumer price level fell by roughly 25%. Falling prices may sound helpful, but during a debt crisis they could make existing debts even heavier in real terms. Imagine owing the same amount of money while your income and the prices of what you sell are falling. That was the trap. Deflation increased the real burden of debt, encouraging businesses and families to cut spending even further. The consequences reached workers' businesses could no longer justify maintaining the same workforce, and unemployment climbed relentlessly. By 1933, approximately 25% of the American labor force was unemployed, roughly 1 worker in 4. Unemployment was not simply a statistic. It meant rent going unpaid, meals becoming smaller, families moving in with relatives, and savings disappearing. Across America, ordinary people who had believed in permanent prosperity were suddenly fighting simply to survive. Farmers entered the crisis with problems of their own. During the 1920s, American agriculture had struggled with overproduction and weak prices. When the Depression reduced demand even further, falling crop prices made already difficult debts almost impossible to manage. Farm incomes collapsed, farms were lost, and rural communities suffered. For many farmers, the problem was not simply producing too little. They were producing goods that buyers could no longer afford at prices that could cover their debts. America was not an isolated economy. Banks, governments, businesses, and investors across the world were financially connected. When the American economy contracted and international lending weakened, financial pressure began spreading through Europe and other regions. The international monetary system made the crisis harder to contain. Countries were tied together through gold and fixed exchange rates, limiting their ability to respond freely. When confidence disappeared, gold reserves and currencies came under intense pressure. In May 1931, Austria's Kreditanstalt, one of the country's largest banks, collapsed. The failure became a major international financial shock, increasing fears that other European banks could also fail. Germany was especially vulnerable. It depended heavily on foreign credit, and when international lenders pulled back, financial pressure intensified. By 1932, German unemployment had reached roughly 6 million people, devastating confidence in the political system. Then Britain faced its own currency crisis. On September 21, 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard after severe pressure on sterling and its reserves. The decision sent another shock through an already fragile international financial system. As countries abandoned gold or defended their currencies, international trade and investment suffered. Governments often responded with higher barriers and competitive devaluations. What had begun as an American downturn had become a worldwide economic crisis. Colonial India was also hit. Global commodity prices collapsed, hurting farmers who depended on agricultural exports. Between 1928 and 1934, wheat prices in India fell by roughly half, placing enormous pressure on already indebted rural families. Many indebted Indian families were forced to sell gold and silver ornaments to survive. Large quantities of Indian gold was subsequently exported, much of it flowing toward Britain. The Depression therefore reached directly into household wealth. Economic collapse rarely remains purely economic. When millions lose jobs, savings, and confidence, they begin questioning the institutions they once trusted. Economic collapse rarely remains purely economic. When millions lose jobs, savings, and confidence, they begin questioning the institutions they once trusted. In Germany, the Depression intensified an already unstable political environment. Extremist movements gained support by promising order, jobs, and national revival. Economic suffering did not automatically create Nazism, but it helped create conditions in which radical politics could grow. On January 30, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. The Depression was not the only reason for his rise, but mass unemployment, political instability, and declining faith in democratic institutions helped create the environment in which his movement could succeed. In the United States, the crisis reached its deepest point in early 1933. The banking system was collapsing, unemployment was at roughly 25%, and confidence in financial institutions had nearly disappeared. In November 1932, Americans elected Franklin D. Roosevelt. When he took office in March 1933, his administration moved rapidly to stabilize the banking system, restore confidence, and begin a broad program of economic reform. Roosevelt's administration temporarily closed the nation's banks in March 1933. During the bank holiday, institutions were examined before reopening. The goal was simple but urgent: stop the panic and convince Americans that their banking system could function again. The government also strengthened banking regulation. The Banking Act of 1933 created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, providing deposit insurance and helping rebuild public confidence in the banking system. Roosevelt's wider program became known as the New Deal. It combined financial reforms, relief programs, and public works. Agencies such as the Civilian Conservation Corps and Works Progress Administration gave millions of Americans opportunities to work. The economy began recovering from the terrible lows of 1933. Roosevelt's monetary and banking policies helped restore confidence, while industrial production and employment improved. Then, in 1937, the recovery suffered another major setback. From May 1937 to June 1938, real GDP fell about 10%, while unemployment reached roughly 20%. The Depression had not disappeared, the recovery was still fragile. The 1937-38 recession became a painful reminder that recovery could reverse. Economic policy was adjusted again, and activity eventually resumed. But America still had not returned to the level of full employment associated with a healthy economy. Meanwhile, Europe was moving toward another catastrophe. Political extremism, militarization, and international tensions were transforming economies. When World War II began in 1939, the United States was not yet fully mobilized, but global demand for American goods was rising rapidly. After the United States entered World War II in December 1941, economic mobilization accelerated dramatically. Factories switched to military production, shipyards expanded, aircraft plants worked around the clock, and millions of workers entered the wartime economy. Government spending and wartime orders created demand on a scale the Depression economy had never experienced. Idle factories were activated, workers were hired, and industrial production surged. The United States was becoming an enormous wartime production machine. The result was transformative. Wartime mobilization brought the United States to full output and employment during World War II. The mass unemployment that had defined the Depression era was finally disappearing on a scale that earlier recovery programs had not achieved. The Great Depression therefore did not end because of one single event. It was a long process involving banking stabilization, monetary changes, economic recovery, government reforms, and finally enormous wartime mobilization that restored full employment and production. The Depression permanently changed the relationship between governments, banks, markets, and ordinary citizens. Financial regulation expanded, deposit insurance became part of the banking system, and policymakers became far more conscious of the dangers of uncontrolled economic collapse. The Great Depression was not simply a story about a stock market crash. It was a chain reaction: speculation, debt, recession, banking panic, deflation, unemployment, international financial crisis, political instability, reform, and finally wartime mobilization. It began with an economy that looked stronger than ever. It ended by transforming the American economy and the wider world. The Great Depression proved that when confidence, credit, banks, and international finance collapse together, an economic crisis can become a crisis of history itself. The Great Depression changed how the world understood economic power, financial stability, and government responsibility. And its lessons still influence the financial system we live with today. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe for more stories that changed the world.